um, what I see here. Um, go screen go.
As far as I could tell, I always thought I was in the group, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to tinker with it now. But I think I don't want to knock myself out of it. But
Module
yeah,
pop
it
up.
shows me as following, so yeah, I'm okay.
But we're tap at the bottom to invite friends. Once your friends are watching, tap this thing, then select a friend from your viewers list and tap add viewers. So, but see, yeah, it doesn't let me click on viewers. Hello, Debbie. I'm still trying to figure this out on how I can add him. And everything that I'm finding is not something that I see. Yeah, this doesn't do that. Doesn't let me click on viewers. Current viewers. So clicking on current viewers, it's not giving me an option of seeing the names of the people who are viewing.
wait, okay. Does it doesn't do me any good if I hit the raise hand emoji right now? Correct? That won't do anything.
I don't know. Go ahead and do it and see what
Yeah, let's
happens.
try it. Let's try it. Okay.
It's just telling me on this message
Yeah.
that you want to speak, even though we're here speaking on
Yeah.
here.
Right, but yeah, but you clicking on that won't be able to allow you to bring me in, though. You don't think either,
No,
right?
because this is doing my personal, not Stephen Avery
Oh, okay.
project. On
Okay.
my computer here, I'm logged in as Stephen Avery project. This is my Jax West thing. How do I get off of there? Because now I don't have the stream. What a mess this is.
Yeah, and I'm looking around here too just to see.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see anything that just allows me to like request or share or that one that you were saying.
Can can people hear you talking through my phone?
That's a good question.
Um,
I'm using a laptop right now, so is that okay?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
that's what I'm using. Yeah.
can you guys hear him through my phone? Okay, Debbie says can hear you.
Okay.
So, I can show you guys right now. He's on my phone. uh, I'll just set you up here. So, okay, they can hear you. So we'll just go this way.
Okay.
Um, yay for you that you don't have to have people looking at you.
Oh no, I'm fine with that.
Let
Just
me
figure
make
it
sure
out.
that I have my phone turned all the way up, and I'll put the microphone down here. And I just dropped my phone. Okay. Oh my god, what did it do? Brought up playing some game on here. Get off of here. Can you still hear me, John?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay.
You sound totally fine.
Okay. All right. Let's get into this now. What is brought up on here? Okay, sorry. What is this person doing? How to go live on Facebook. Thank you, Alan, for posting that. But we're just gonna go with this now, and I'll show here he is on my phone. All right, thank you very much, John, for joining us. I know you joined me when you put your book out 5 years ago, um, but your new book or the new edition has a whole lot of extra stuff that I find very interesting. I've got a list of questions that moderator Christopher put together. And so I am going to go through this list here and then I'll add my own as we go through. First question is what made you want to get involved in the Stephen Avery case?
Well, that would take us back to when Making Murder came out back in December of 2015. And just let me stop for a second. Do I sound okay to you and everybody else? First of all,
Yeah.
can you guys hear me? Okay, thumbs up. Okay,
Yes.
all right. Just making sure before I
Yeah.
talk for the next hour and a half or whatever. So, um, and that answer may take an hour and a half. So I'll try to make it concise. But the background was I was a reporter with the USA Today, the Wisconsin team at that point in time. So they had the 10 or 11 daily newspapers across Wisconsin. I was based in Appleton, about an hour away from Manitowoc, and a couple of my bosses, my editors, were really intrigued and startled by Making Murder coming out, and they had actually did a lot of the videography, a lot of the online journalism back when Stephen and Brendan went to trial back in '07. So, and I remember a couple of them coming up to me afterwards, and they were among the few journalists, I would say, that were very skeptical as far as that Stephen and Brendan had fair trials back then. So they were very excited. It's not the right word, but just they were very interested to dig into the case and sort of set the record straight rather than just taking the facts that were reported back in '05, '06, and '07 as gospel and just moving on from there. So they gave me the opportunity, and an open budget too at the time, but to do as much legwork, investigative reporting, and spend as much money within reason, of course, that I needed to. And that was mostly just to copy documents and and get some of the videos from from Stevens from the civil trial. His case against the Manitowoc Sheriff's Office, and you guys have seen a lot of those videos already. But it was like tracking down a lot of those video depositions of Andy Colburn and Ken Peterson, the sheriff, and Sandy Morris, all those kinds of people. But the one thing about me was that I was gone from Wisconsin. I had been in Green Bay from 2000 to 2003, so about 4 years, and then I was in Omaha, Nebraska for 9 years. So I was gone at the time that Teresa disappeared, October of Halloween of 2005. I was gone, when Stephen and Brendan were arrested and when they went to trial. And then I came back basically 2 years before, actually 3 years, 3 years before Making a Murder came out. So I like the fact that I was pretty fresh, like everybody else, that's probably on this call, where you knew a little bit about the case, you may have heard about the case, but you didn't know all the intricacies of the case and and how Stephen and Brendan were arrested. You just knew that they were convicted of the crime. There were some allegations that maybe they didn't get fair trials. So I had a fresh perspective, and I also had a reputation, of not being afraid to, pull punches when it came to police and police misconduct. So that's one of the reasons why I think Joel and Terry had, were supportive of giving me the opportunity to do the research and the reporting. On Stephen and Brendan's case. So I just kind of dug into it, and it just one story led to another story, which ultimately led to the book.
And so, did you have an opinion on guilt or innocence before you looked into it, and did that change after you started investigating?
Well, I would say that, I probably, when I came into the case, Jax, like everybody else that didn't know any better, I presume that that they were guilty of the crimes just because, the fact that their cases went to a jury, and so many years had passed, and there really hadn't been much in the news, so to speak, from the time period that Brendan and Stephen were both convicted, until Making a Murder hit the world, through Netflix. So I didn't have any reason at the time, other than, like I said, just talking to a couple of my editors that just thought that it was really worth Wisconsin Gannett's USA Today's time and energy to really dig into the cases from start over, and let's see how things let's see what I can come up with as far as my reporting, and that's kind of what led me and probably a lot of people here on the call as well, the video, but just to look at, kind of the clue game, as far as other potential suspects in the case. And the more I started getting my hands on, the police reports and the trial transcripts, probably more so the police reports, but just it kind of opened my eyes to the possibility that there could easily have been, 6 to 10 other viable suspects, and then it just boils down to spending time and energy as far as either advancing those people as suspects or eliminating them or reducing the possibility and probability. And a lot of you would know some of these are people, I spent time looking at the George Zippers of the world, the Bradley Checks of the world, and certainly, Ryan Hilligus and Scott, Blodorn as well.
Right.
So, and those are just the immediate ones that just come to my mind right
Right.
now. There was another 5 or 6 as well, but I spent just as much time pursuing those individuals, as I did, eventually Bobby Dassey. So.
Right. And since you're a journalist, how do you feel about like the guilters or convicting a murderer people who try to say something like making a murderer isn't showing you everything, and that if you knew all there was on the case, you would think guilty. um as somebody who has done a lot of investigating yourself.
I mean, I always kind of get, as a journalist, especially one that really prides myself on doing, the research and the legwork and the shoe leather reporting. I kind of feel that I'm in as good a position as anybody as far as to judge whether or not, there was, um, with the documentary, or whether or not there was legitimate reporting, or whether people cut corners as far as the documentary goes. And I certainly felt that everything people watched from Making a Murderer, got it right as far as giving you all the key components of the cases against Stephen and Brendan. And you didn't feel that you had to watch Convicting a Murderer and then walk away from that, and feel, wow, there was like 3 or 4 different pieces of evidence against Stephen or Brendan that Making a Murderer had withheld from me. Damn it. So it was. I mean, as everybody knows here, Convicting a Murderer was really about these backstories and rumors and innuendos that really had nothing to do with the actual Teresa Hallbuck disappearance, murder, and dismemberment. It was all these irrelevant things that Judge Willis, rightfully so, regardless of what opinion you have of Judge Willis, but he didn't even allow that garbage into the trial. So so if it wasn't even good enough for Willis, then it certainly wasn't good enough for a documentary.
Right.
But yeah, so that's kind of my take on that.
um so do you believe Stephen is innocent?
I mean, I don't really have a opinion like 100% guilt or innocent on him, but I do think that a lot of the information and evidence that Kathleen Zellner and everybody else here, for that matter, and myself, has uncovered, definitely points to the possibility and strong probability that there could be an alternative suspect and somebody else that committed the crime. Just because if you take the position that Stephen Avery is guilty, I think you have to realize that the version of events that was presented at his trial is not factually how Teresa Hallbuck met her death. So I have a lot more respect for people that come and say, you know what, I'm not really sure after watching the documentary or reading your book or doing the research online, through your group and others, whether or not Stephen is guilty or not, or other people that say, I still think he probably did it, but you know what, the way that the trial was rigged against him, they should make him, he should be allowed to get another trial, because again, in our American justice system, as I was telling somebody a couple of days ago on an interview, even if you committed the crime, the police and the prosecution aren't allowed to stack the deck and
Yeah.
fabricate half the evidence against you. So and nobody on this call on the should
Hmm.
walk away, especially guilters for that matter, saying what, it's okay for the police to fabricate a little bit of or a lot of evidence if the son of a bitch is really guilty.
Right.
And I kind of got that impression as far as with a lot of the guilters early on, is that a lot of them just totally ignored or didn't want to talk about or debate, the possibility and probability that a lot of the evidence used against Stephen and Brendan, was fabricated, and made up.
Hmm.
And so that from that standpoint, it was really hard to kind of take a lot of those people seriously,
Yeah.
Jax, just because they just weren't open minded. I would have respected a lot more of them if they would have come back and said, I think Stephen's guilty, and I also think the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office should not have been involved in the case, and they definitely planted, the key in his bedroom, and because they did that, and the license plates in the vehicle, the
Yeah.
ones that were found a few days later, I for those reasons he should get a new trial. But you don't see or hear very many of those people, and the limited that I watched of convicting a murderer, I just wasn't impressed with Candace Owens and her knowledge of the
Hmm.
case. She just kind of came in as as a celebrity, and it just kind of wanted to be and portray herself as this righteous celebrity that really is kind of pro police. And there's nothing wrong with being pro police,
Right.
but you also have to step back and realize that sometimes the police, especially in smaller communities, well, I haven't met big ones too, but I should
Hmm.
say, especially in smaller communities like this, where cronyism and nepotism, appears to be involved as far as who gets hired, and is
Right.
serving law enforcement, that there can and definitely could be corruption going on. And she just didn't seem like she just was up, or she just wasn't up on her game, and it
Right.
definitely showed, from what I saw in convicting a murderer.
Well, I found it really hypocritical because they kept saying that making a murderer was only showing you one thing and not giving you, like, Colborn on the stand saying that, well, you didn't show everything that he said there. And it's like, but neither were they in, because it's a TV show. You're only allowed X amount of time, so you can't show everything. So to be attacking making a murderer or books that are written and saying that it's not given all the information, well, neither did they can't. People, this is, this to me is, it's a first step of, so you watch making a murder and then you go and do your own research. You got,
Research, right? And I was going to say along those lines too, Jax, I don't see very many people that are probably on tonight's call that they come back and say, Make Your Murder was really good, but I wish they would have put in this part or that part or that part. I mean, again, it was 10 parts to begin with, and
right.
arguably it was 20 parts because two
Right.
times 10 equals 20. So
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I mean, that's pretty thorough, for a documentary. So, I mean, unfortunately, as you know, and everybody else knows too, if you put out a product or you're at the top of your game, or you're a celebrity, kind of like they became, you know, um, more and more as far as putting out the Emmy award-winning documentary Making
Mm-hmm.
Murder, you're going to definitely be open up for criticism. So the
Right.
question is just what is how what is the legitimacy of the criticism, and and when you just kind of hear repeated arguments of, oh, they splice things or
Yeah.
took things out of context. I mean, those are the same arguments me as a reporter, that I've heard for 20, 25 years, as far as from people that that didn't like a story that I did on them, an expose on a politician, or a
Mm-hmm.
prosecutor, or or a police officer and stuff. So
Yeah.
it's just, I mean, you just kind of become used to that, and it's kind of becomes, and it should be, for them, a badge of honor as far as those kinds of arguments,
Mm-hmm.
and and I thought one of the most ridiculous items, and that's why I wanted to highlight it as much as I did in the book, was the whole Andy Colburn
Yeah.
defamation lawsuit, against Netflix of all things.
Right. Well, Are you surprised at all by the press that was in Making a Murderer? And I know you didn't watch all of Convicting a Murderer, but most of them are involved in convicting a murderer. And so these people that attended Stephen's and Brendan's trials are there on Convicting a Murderer saying they
Yeah.
think Stephen is guilty. I
Yeah, I mean, I saw that part I did catch, in the 2 or 3 episodes I watched, and I was kind of, I mean, I was offered the opportunity early on to participate and get involved in that stuff. That Seth Rich had reached out to me,
uh-huh.
early on, and and I didn't want any part of that, just because. My biggest concern was just that it wasn't going to be professionally done to begin with, So
Sure.
I didn't want to be have my name associated with, with something that was going to be less than, what Making a Murderer was. So that's why I pretty much
Mhm.
stayed away from it, And then I see some of these individuals like Anjanette Levy and and all these other ones that were just kind of stool pigeons for the most part, in
Mhm.
the original coverage of Stephen Avery's case and Brendan's case, the fact that they would flock for the opportunity to be on the camera again.
Yeah.
I just don't think, to begin with, Jax, they didn't contribute that much as far as like doing major investigative reporting or major journalism, to either advance or even help convict Stephen or Brendan, or the opposite.
Mhm.
They just kind of were there along for the ride. So I
Right.
always kind of sometimes get taken aback or get a little pissed, when I see other journalists just kind of just going along, for the opportunity to be on a camera, when they themselves really didn't do a whole lot, other than they just happened to be, in the courtroom along with 35 or 40 other people and stuff. So
Right.
there's definitely other people, that did some, legitimate reporting on Stephen's case, or coverage that, I think for the right reasons stayed in the background and had nothing to do with convicting a murderer.
Yeah. Well, and I've said this for years. It's not because you're on here with me. So even prior to the book, just your articles in the patch on the case, I think you are the one that does the best coverage
Thank you.
of
I
the
appreciate
case.
it.
And there's many books on the case. Yours, I think, hands down, is the best one that I always recommend to people. So, what is your process for what to write this book? So what? How do you do your research? What's the how long does that take?
Do you want me to answer that question? Talking about the original book, Jax, or the updated book, or both, kind of? Just
Both, kind of.
both.
Yeah.
Both. Okay, gotcha. Okay, because they're a little different
Sure.
answers. But originally, I think that the one thing that I wanted to do with Wrecking Crew was knowing ahead of time. You already had, just for everybody's to remind everybody, you already had Ken Kratz, and I think had already put out his book. Mike Griesbach had either done 1 or 2 books at that point in time, and then obviously you had Making a Murder that was already out there. So I kind of know ahead of time, and I thought Making a Murder was well done, as I've always pretty much maintained, and I compliment the producers for their great work on the case. But I also didn't want, if I'm going to put out a book, I don't want to, repeat what they already have, because that's doing a disservice to all of you, and it's certainly, is arguably wasting my time, to be doing that. So if
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do my own book, it's got to be something different. And again, it's not you know, um, you know, not the offense, of Making a Murderer or the producers. It's just that there were certain things that I could do as a reporter, that are better for the written word, than on screen and on camera. And I think the one thing that I really tried to do with Wrecking Crew was set the tone as far as the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office, and let people know, because in Making a Murder, you basically get 1985. You get Stephen being arrested for the brutal, sexual assault attempt on
Mm-hmm.
Penny Bernstein.
That always
Um,
bothers me when
as you
people
say, you
say she
pointed it
was
out to me,
raped.
so I, I,
Yeah.
I That's how I worded it tonight.
Yes.
At the and but you get that, but and then you fast forward to 2003, 2005, 2003. Stephen getting out of jail, out of prison, in the first episode. But what I thought was really interesting is I did my reporting, in preparation for determining whether or not I was even going to do a book, was that I really found it interesting to step back and say, if you take it at face value that Stephen and Brendan are guilty of these crimes, what are the odds that the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office, an agency that really has no experience at all handling high profile, sophisticated murder investigations, that within a matter of 8 or 9 days, that they're going to be able to have all this evidence fall into place just so perfectly, from the key being found on the bedroom floor, the 6th or 7th, and they're just going to be smart enough to go back there and say, you know what, Andy, Jim, hey, why don't you guys go back in there one more time? I mean, those would have to be the conversations that would have to happen, if these guys were that smart, and sophisticated. And the same thing along those lines would be like with Fassbender and Uyghur. There was that big full day long search. I'm pretty sure it was on Sunday. The day after the Hallbuck vehicle was found, where they actually went car to car on that property, and went through everything to see, if they could find her purse,
Right.
I mean, but, her body, they went through that whole junkyard, and pretty much marked what vehicles that they had checked. So that happens on Sunday. So again, what are the odds then that somebody like Uyghur and Fassbender are going to tell everybody, hey, let's go back again, on Tuesday, and then that's going to be when that obscure, was he the firefighter, or the brilliant police officer? I forget what he was. No, he was not a brilliant police officer, but the firefighter that found the crumbled up license plate. That's what I'm getting at, So I mean, again, the first search, is exhaustive. It turns up nothing, and then somehow, Jerry Pagel and everybody else is going to decide, you know what? Let's just do one more search again. And not even the next day. It's like 2 or 3 days later, the same day that the key is going to be found on the floor, and then that's also the same day that Teresa's bones, some of her bones, were found in the burn pit. So you have everything happening on November 8th, and then Stephen gets arrested on that trumped up charge or whatever, with the gun, on November 9th. But for all intents and purposes, that that was him being charged with, arrested for the murder, that day. But so I was kind of rambling a little bit, but my point was, again, just the whole notion that these guys that don't have the experience to handle a high profile murder case, that somehow they're all going to come together and all the stars are going to align, and they're going to solve this case. And I just went back and did research on other cases and other controversial cases that they had handled over the years. And I just thought it was really interesting to begin with, as far as how in the world, like people like Andy Colburn, Ken Peterson, the Herman brothers. Who else am I missing? Jost. Jost. He's the one that finds the bones, and then he's also involved in the Ricky Hostetler case, big time. Mike Bushman too. So
were you involved? Were you looking into the Ricky Hostetler case before getting involved in this one, or did that come after?
No, well, it came shortly thereafter. So it wasn't long after, I started doing a few stories on on Stephen and Brendan, as far as for the Wisconsin Gannett team, that different people had contacted me and asked me to research, that case. In fact, one person, I'll keep his name, out of the conversation here, just because he's always wanted the anonymity. But he works. Well, I think he still does, unless he's retired. But he worked in law enforcement, so he had worked with a lot of these people. So when you got somebody on the inside, that's telling you, hey, this case stinks to high heaven, and I was around when it happened. Then I know that I'm not just taking a phone call from some disgruntled person in town that may have gotten a speeding ticket from the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office case, for the wrong reasons probably, but but like I said, I knew that I had a good lead to work with as far as since it was coming from the inside.
Right. Do you think Ricky was hit by a police officer or a deputy?
Yeah, I think that that's a probability. And I mean, I still remember. I mean, I looked very hard at. I know people got it mixed up, as far as who was the possible, probable person that did it.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people thought it was Rob Herman, but I always thought that it was more likely that it was Todd Herman, and that Rob actually got called out in the middle of the night, or alerted, and that would make more sense too, as far as just that he would have been under. I mean, if you would just hit and killed somebody, then the notion that 5 minutes later you would also be out doing an investigation. I mean, our nerves would be,
Right.
shot and frazzled. So it made more sense that Rob, who was working as at that point in time, they had him as the juvenile jail administrator. He was doing an obscure job, but somehow he gets called out in the middle of the night to help in this investigation, and he's driving around. He picks up and scoops up parts, from the crash scene. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
totally, improper, as I
Right.
pointed out in some of my stories.
Sure.
For Jeanette. I mean, the notion that that police officer would be able to just scoop up, car parts from a fatality accident and then
Mm-hmm.
drive around with them in the middle of the night, under the idea that somehow they're just going to try to match them up and kind of get an idea what kind of vehicle hit Ricky. I mean,
Yeah.
and it was just crazy. But the thing was, is that as I started looking at his case, the and everything was kind of pointing back to Todd Herman. I still remember like how I tracked Todd down, through his cell phone, and I called him for an interview on a week that he was on vacation, of all things, actually. And the phone just kind of went silent, like when I introduced myself and told him I was calling on that, and then it just kind of no comment. And
Oh.
then I had like two or three of those,
Mm-hmm.
and I know I worked that into one of the stories. I did a multi-part series at one point in time, that, and I'm sure it's still online for Gannett, Wisconsin, about Ricky Hostetler's death and and the case. But it just the one that just it just kind of struck me, and there was a lot of people that thought and believed that night that there was a party, and it
Right.
got mixed up actually, as far as people kept saying it was a cops party, but I think there was several police officers that were at the bar that night, and at the banquet hall that was
Okay.
just right up the road from where Ricky was killed. But there was a grocery store party that was going on for Cops, the grocery store. But
Ah.
nonetheless, um, there was a possibility, that Todd and others, were at the the banquet hall that night, and it was a snowy night. I still remember the videos, that I tracked down.
Mm-hmm.
The snow was coming down pretty hard that night, and whoever would have hit Ricky Jax
Yeah.
would have done so totally unintentionally.
Sure.
But again, if they were drinking, regardless of who it was, whoever did it, they panicked it and left. Now, the thing that I found really interesting as a reporter, being back in Wisconsin working on his case after making murder and looking at the sheriff's office corruption,
Mm-hmm.
cronyism, all that stuff, was that was in such a rural area where that happened. There would have been very few cars on the road that night. So
Right.
if you're the police, you get a call, hey, 17-year-old boy just got run over in the on the road. You would think the police would be able to very quickly kind of blanket that whole area and be able to follow the snow tracks,
Right.
among
Yeah.
other things too. And none of that happens. But yeah, clearly whoever hit Ricky was heading. They were heading. I'm pretty sure it was south. I know it was in the direction like toward Milwaukee, but they were on the country road. But again,
Mm-hmm.
where the direction of the vehicle went, and again, there was certain car parts that were still dropped, after.
Ah.
So that was even further clues that whoever did this, hit Ricky, where they were going, and
Mm-hmm.
the direction that the vehicle was going was back toward Cleveland, and the Herman brothers were from Cleveland. Their dad had been a sheriff's deputy, and their dad had that competitive, salvage yard,
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, there was all kinds of stories that, rumors that I had heard that I never worked in any of my stories, and I don't think I worked in any of my books either, or the book on the case, just
Mm-hmm.
because there was no proof of that. But people were saying that, that the garage lights at the Hermans, was on, throughout the night, and making it a possibility or probability that, that if one of them hit Ricky, let's just,
Mm-hmm.
get woken off of the Todd Herman possibility that, could have taken the vehicle back to the family's salvage yard. And again, if the sheriff's office isn't going to make any efforts at all that night to solve the case, or in the opposite, they're going to work the investigation to fool the public, which is what I believe they did by coming up with, within a matter of days, you had them putting out a photo of a van of all things, just a
Mm.
big honking van, and just said,
Yeah.
this is the kind of vehicle we're looking for. When in reality,
Uh,
it was more likely that Ricky was hit by a small type of vehicle, possibly a sports car, and there was parts of that vehicle that were broken off and found, literally right out front of the driveway. When the snow started to melt, Jax,
okay.
not that far from where Ricky and his mom Debbie lived.
Okay. And so now, in doing this 5 year anniversary edition, were you always going to be doing something for 5 year anniversary, or is it because there's new developments that you updated your book?
It was mostly because of the new developments in the case. I had my book publisher, Wild Blue Press, had reached out to me 2 or 3 times over the last 3 or 4 years, just asking, hey, is there any way to do, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you know, get us an update on Stephen's case? You know, um, they thought that that would be something that people would really be interested in, and I kind of weighed that, I thought about that a lot, but there were different times that it just didn't seem that. I just didn't feel that I didn't want to do an update just for the sake of doing an update, Jax, and
Right.
um, so uh, so I just thought over the last year or so, with what happened and the fact then that my publisher reached out to me back in the summertime, pointing out, hey, it's going to be 5 years with the book. Is there
Mm-hmm.
a possibility, to do an update at this point in time? This year, more than anything, I kind of felt would make, kind of gave me the reason, and the feeling that now would be a good time to do it. Just with so many of the different things that have happened,
Right.
and that was even before we got the new judge on the case. That just kind of got dropped in my lap here,
Right.
a couple months ago out of nowhere. So,
What are your thoughts on the new judge? Do you know anything about them?
I mean, from what limited information, that's out there, um, I mean, he seems like he's got the type of background, Jax, that, you know, given what Stevens had to deal with, and Kathleen for that matter, with Angela Suckowitz the last several years,
Mm-hmm.
as far as getting a judge that pretty much just has blinders on,
Right.
and just refuses to even acknowledge strong evidence pointing to Bobby Dassey as an alternative suspect, won't even allow a Denny hearing, even when you have three eyewitnesses that see Bobby Dassey in Teresa Halbach's vehicle or pushing the vehicle,
Mm-hmm.
hours before it's going to be found. So I think, and she was an insider, as a lot of people know. She had connections with Ken Kratz, other people in Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I was doing research for this book, I just stumbled across, there was an article a couple years ago that like named her like the Wisconsin Judge of the Year,
Oh.
which I just kind of laughed at because my colleague Eric Lickey did stories on her years ago, just how she was like one of the least um, respected judges in Wisconsin,
Wow.
based on the fact that a lot of defense attorneys and the way Eric did his reporting was just that he researched just all of Wisconsin's judges, and one way to kind of get an idea of like how judges, are deemed or respected is to look at how often a defense attorney, asks for a recusal, and gets a different judge
Okay.
to handle the case. And her numbers were through the roof.
Hmm.
And again, that was prior to, making a murderer. He was doing these stories on her. So I just found it fascinating that she already had a reputation for being a pretty mediocre judge always to begin with. we have had a chance to analyze her opinions post conviction, rulings. In Stephen's case over all these last several years,
Mm-hmm.
where she's pretty much kind of wiped away or absolved herself, from any of the Brady violations,
Yeah.
any of the evidence planning allegations, and certainly the Denny, allegations, just because she's wanted to make sure that the case stayed as is, as far as no evidentiary hearing, no new trial, no part three of no season three of Making Murder. Just I'm not going to do anything at all to change the case.
Mm-hmm.
And then it seemed like as her reward for doing that, the state of Wisconsin names her a judge of the year.
Ugh.
So anyway,
Eek.
but then yeah, so when you take all that into consideration, and then this brand new judge, I
Mm-hmm.
think that without knowing anything at all about him, I mean, the positives are that he started his career as a police officer and changed and became a lawyer. And I've seen and known a lot of people that have done that over the years, and they're usually pretty good lawyers. So I've seen, like I said, I've worked with a lot of places where people just they start out as police officers and then decide to get a law
Yeah.
degree and fight for justice. Then,
Right.
so I think that gives them a better they're more open minded and can see things a lot differently than just being a police officer that is charged with just making an arrest or getting a conviction and no matter what that's how they're judged by. So
Right.
and then the fact that this guy had served this Judge Lambrick had served then as a public defender for 5 or 6 years, Jax. I think that's another positive as far as it's somebody that he's been on the defense side of things and he's represented people that are poor and indigent. So I think that one would hope that he can relate with a Brendan and a Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously even more so, but just since he's not going to be handling Brendan's case,
Yeah.
but just you would hope that he can identify more with them. Whereas the scary alternative I always felt with Angie Suckowitz was that she didn't really pay attention to all the defendants and their backgrounds. She wanted to identify with, the political aristocrats of Wisconsin.
Oh.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's more to her about who she's going out to dinner with, at the Kohler Club.
Oh boy.
So
Yeah.
rather than analyzing evidence,
Mm-hmm.
at a time, or looking at, Zellner's motions,
Yeah.
really giving them the consideration that I think the federal judges have at times, like this Judge Ludwig, the one that handled, Andy Colburn's Netflix lawsuit. I thought he wrote a masterful, ruling and opinion as far as, when he discussed the case against Netflix back in March.
Well, and so you talk with Kathleen all the time, and also in the book is a conversation with Stephen. So how do they feel about the new judge?
I think they're optimistic. I mean, they're like you and I for that matter. As far as we don't know a whole lot about like other key. I mean, he doesn't really have a track record as far as legal opinions to analyze him on. All you can really kind of do is just study his background as far as his career background that kind of led him up to becoming a judge back in, I think it was April this year, is when he ran unopposed. And he had been an assistant district attorney previous to that. So, I mean, I guess, and this could be a negative, but I mean, he followed in Mike Griesbach's footsteps as far as Mike Griesbach was an assistant district attorney at one point in time too. So you got to take that into consideration as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think their biggest hope, well, I can tell you, one of their biggest hopes before the announcement came as far as what judge it was going to be, was that Kathleen did not want, and I'm sure Stephen would have felt the same way too, but they did not want some, good old boy or good old person,
Sure.
somebody from the old Manitowoc, political guard or establishment getting assigned to Stephen's case, and there are a couple of, I mean, Mark Rohr is still a judge to this point in time. So, I mean, can you imagine that possibility?
Oh, wow.
I mean, hey, if it's okay for Lincoln Colbert to be, wandering around Stephen's bedroom, then why in the world couldn't Mark Rohr say, hey, I'll take the case from here on out,
Oh
so
my gosh.
stranger things have happened in this case,
Yeah.
so I mean, that was a possibility,
Yeah.
that you had Mark Rohr handling this case.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, in this case is so crazy to begin. I mean, so it wouldn't be a shock, you know.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So when I was looking at and I know she and Stephen, they always wanted the case to go back to Manitowoc County as far as like not for a jury, but just for like a judicial,
Yeah.
review, because they felt that, hey, so many years have passed, there's really no reason that like Sheboygan of all places should handle the case, and that's a
Yeah.
good argument because I mean theoretically, if Sheboygan got the case, couldn't you also make the argument that it could have been a judge from Fond du Lac County or Brown County in Green Bay, or
Mm-hmm.
Outagamie County in Appleton? It's just that she just Angie Suckowitz got picked. It was Sheboygan County, and that's the way it just stayed that way. So in theory, it shouldn't always. It should not have stayed as a Sheboygan County case if she was going to get off the case for whatever reason, and
Yeah.
she did. So I think that from Zellner's perspective, then Jax, the fact that you had 4 or 5 judges, and then this brand new judge is one that got the case. From their standpoint, they're hopeful that this is the best, alternative, because they got to have somebody. So,
Right.
who's it going to be? And it happened to be this brand new judge that, at least what works in his favor is that there's no evidence right now that he's part of the, good old boys
Right.
club in Sheboygan. I'm sorry, in Manitowoc County,
Right.
for that matter. But just that he seems to be a fresh set of eyes, and you hope that, once he finally gets some, rulings, in the case, if he does, because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, remind everybody right now that the August ruling that went against Zellner from Suckowitz,
Yeah.
that's going to be before the Court of Appeals again, so he's not going to rule on that. It's going to first go to the Court of Appeals, but at
Okay.
some point in time, this case will probably go before him, and it could go before him for either a new trial or an evidentiary hearing. So if that's the case,
Mm-hmm.
you hope that he's open-minded, and really is able to put, block out all the noise as far as, the people, the politicians, and other, political bigwigs in Wisconsin that just don't want Stephen or Brendan to ever have an opportunity for a
Right.
new trial, let alone get out of jail or prison, but just
Mm-hmm.
even give them, another hearing,
Yeah.
before a courtroom.
What do you think of the new slash I say new slash old, since these witnesses, one of them in particular, tried to reach out right when the case was originally happening and nothing happened with it. What do you think of these new witnesses?
I mean, I think that's really fascinating to me, and that's one of the key angles that motivated me as far as to update the book to Jax, was
Mm-hmm.
because I found that really fascinating. That it's not like somebody just I mean, I think about the early days after Making a Murderer, and I think of um, I think of the crap, with Dr. Phil, like taking advantage, or
Oh
that
God.
woman showing up,
Yeah.
Hartman, was it
Mm-hmm.
Lynn Hartman,
Lynn
whatever,
Hartman.
just showing up, for her 30 seconds of fame and getting a
Yeah.
free airplane ride and a few $1,000 probably stuffed in her pockets, to be
Mm-hmm.
on, the shows for that kind of crap. But I mean, so I point that out for everybody to remind you that this person here, a lot of these people, especially Tom Sawinski, is not motivated at all by money or fame. I mean, he wasn't doing this at all to, get in the limelight. He just had contacted, or thought he had contacted,
Right.
Buting and Strang. And in reality, as I point out in the book update, he had sent it in email. Sorry, I got a dog in the background. So, um, um, but the no, he had contacted the Innocence Project,
Right.
and was trying to let them know, hey, I had contacted, the police to try to let them know that I did in fact see something out there.
Mm-hmm.
And, and lo and behold, we find out that it's proven that he had, and they just never followed up on, on that angle. So I just thought, out of all the things that have happened since the original Making a Murderer, so many people come forward and everything like that,
Right.
that's probably the most important person and event that I could think of as far as, something just coming forward that I mean, it's one thing for you or I or everybody on this, call
Yeah.
or platform to say, I believe Stephen Avery's innocent, but then to struggle to come up with an alternative suspect or
Mm-hmm.
evidence to really bolster that. And here we have a guy, that's doing his job. He's not snooping around. He's a newspaper delivery driver,
Mm-hmm.
and he just happens to come across just about 5 or 6 hours before, Pam Sturm and her daughter, are gonna be led by God,
Yeah.
as I say with the straight face.
Uh-huh.
But by led by God to the back of the Avery salvage yard property, and find Teresa's vehicle. I was gonna say hidden too, but it wasn't hidden. It was intentionally,
Right.
covered with branches and trees. That was supposed to be the beacon for them. It
Yeah.
wasn't that they were, that
Right.
vehicle was hidden or covered up. That was the beacon. You look for
Mm-hmm.
a vehicle that you'll know it when you see it, kind of
Right.
scenario.
Absolutely.
But the fact that you would have a newspaper delivery driver see Bobby Dassey and a second person, a friend of his, pushing this vehicle in the middle of the night, just 4 to 6 hours before the vehicle's going to turn up there,
Mm-hmm.
I thought was explosive. As far as it's a huge, unknown that, again, Making Murder didn't know about. I didn't know about when I wrote the
Right.
book at first. Kathleen Zellner didn't know about, and certainly Buting and Strang didn't know about. But the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office could have and arguably did know about it. They just decided, that
Right.
they were not going to pursue this. And so I thought, so the thing that was really important then to me was that this could be a huge Brady violation.
Mm-hmm.
The fact this wasn't turned over to Buting and Strang, and then at the same time, and even more important to that, is that it solidifies and bolsters Zellner's argument as far as that Bobby Dassey, in her mind, is the most logical alternative suspect as far
Right.
as being responsible for Teresa Halbach's disappearance and and killing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think for sure this guy has so much credibility because he did come forward right when he saw it. He's not somebody that saw Making a Murderer and now wants to get attached to it in some way. He did the right thing at the time, and whatever happened to his phone call happened.
Right, and that's not to minimize like Kevin Ramlow's contribution to the
No.
case. He's just somebody that again had moved to. I think he was living in a different state by the
Right.
time Making a Murder had come out. So he had kind of moved on with his life. Just
Mm-hmm.
and then. In fairness to Kevin, Making a Murder comes out and that jogged
Sure.
his memory.
Right.
And then he contacts, of all people, Scott, Tadich, and
Yes.
and obviously that conversation didn't go very well.
Right.
But I thought Kevin Ramlow makes a big, I mean, he was one of the first persons I felt that kind of came forward that was willing to put his name out there, and sign an affidavit for Kathleen Zellner,
Right.
and, put himself up to public scrutiny and certainly, let law enforcement come after him or try to come after him or tear him down, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But
That's scary because,
yeah,
yeah, a lot of people have come forward saying things about Manitowoc. I mean, in retribution, and I mean, and look at where Stephen and Brendan are. So I totally get being fearful to come forward.
there was even, it's in the early part of Wrecking Crew, the book, but I know I explained in there, again, this was kind of getting back to that, the culture of corruption that I had investigated thank you. But I point out when I was going through doing my research, even when Stephen was still in prison for the attempted rape of Penny Bernstein, you had, there was a few people in town, but one in particular that was going around talking to people in town and just saying that he knew Stephen was innocent. And that one guy had even contacted, he went to the candy store, and
Uh-huh.
lo and behold, what happens? The sheriff of all people, Tom Kasarik, pays a visit to this guy and tells him, that if he goes around, keeps saying this kind of stuff, he's going to get arrested, for a felony. And again, as
Mm.
I point out the other day on an interview that I did in the case, that's the sheriff taking the initiative to do that. It's not, him delegating a responsibility,
Yeah.
to a flunky or a rookie deputy. That's Kasarik himself going, telling somebody eye to eye, basically, we got the right person for the crime, and
Yeah.
just leave it. Come to us if you have, which basically means come to us and we're going to be the vacuum, and suck up your information, and never, it's not going to go anywhere. But you in that kind of scenario where I'm sure that guy, after being told that, wasn't going to go around and I mean, he was going to keep his mouth shut at that point in time.
Sure.
So it just there was just the fear, the fear of law enforcement, and just the fear of going against the system. I think was great, especially for Stephen's first case, and then let alone the fact that so many people started to have questions about what happened or what they saw as far as with Hallbeck leaving the property,
Uh-huh.
and her vehicle being seen by the propane
Right.
driver. I mean, just and then her vehicle being seen at the turnabout. So, I mean, these
Mm-hmm.
people all could have been imagining it. It's like, when there's, the lights in the sky and the UFO, different UFO scenarios and stuff like that. When, if everybody in town is seeing it, there's probably something going on in the sky,
Yeah.
whether it's motions or, or somebody from a different planet, who knows? But, I mean, but just the fact that you had so many different people, Jax, coming forward, seeing different things, about
Mm-hmm.
Hallbuck, made me think, that there probably was something that happened as far as that it didn't go down the way that Ken Kratz had presented it, at the trial.
Yeah.
There's probably another story, and that other story may lead us all back to Cuss Road, perhaps. So.
Mm-hmm. Right. In the stupid convicting a murderer, his brother Earl is on there a whole lot saying Stephen is guilty. Um, did Stephen or Kathleen have anything to say about Earl, or do you have any thoughts on Earl?
No, that was no. I didn't bring that up, or they didn't bring that up to me either. But I mean, I've known Earl for several years, and I've spent a lot of time on the salvage yard, working with him, and just having access to the property, between him and Chuck and stuff. And
Right.
I was still would say I get along with them both real fine. So that would surprise me, that Earl would go on camera, and say that, just because. My conversations with him, he just seemed to be like everybody else. When I would talk to him in person, that he came off as it, he didn't know, who did the crime. I mean, he was obviously adamant that he didn't do it,
Right.
but he also didn't. He never struck me as that he somehow believed that Stephen was, 100% responsible. So that would surprise me if if you're saying that he does come off on camera saying
Oh
that
yeah.
Stephen probably
It's
yeah.
Earl and Candy Avery and Kayla are
Mm-hmm.
all on that convicting a murderer and all saying, well, Kayla doesn't say it, but Earl and Candy both say Stephen is guilty.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I mean, people's opinions change. I mean, maybe in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been some revelation, or just he stewed on it, But again, I kind of go back to, even Judge Willis, as I point out in the book update. He puts that note into the file after the fact, and basically, wants everybody to know, whoever's going to read the file at some point in time, that Brendan Dassey's version of events cannot be corroborated by evidence. And then what does Judge Suckowitz do in August of this year? To try to
Yeah.
yarn, or I should say bandage together, a ruling that could go against Zellner, but she brings up Brendan Dassey's, confession, and statement, incriminating statement, to help, base her opinion on why Bobby Dassey's, why, is not, qualified as a Denny,
Yeah.
suspect in her eyes. So
Well,
it's
I
just
just
crazy.
it's one of the things that I will never understand on this case, how you can have two people tried for the same case but different scenarios, and there's no Brendan in Stephen's case.
Mm-hmm.
In two different places. Is it in the trailer? Is it in the garage? Is it in the library with the candlestick? I mean,
Right. And that's why, like, I mean, I mean, I think everybody has to at least be open-minded, until we know 100% for sure what happened in this case, which will probably never happen. But
Right.
but you just have to be open to the possibility that Stephen could have done the crime. But here's the thing: is that if he did do the crime, it did not happen the way that it was presented at trial. It would have
Sure.
had to have been a completely different scenario. There's that cellar, next, not that far from their property. I mean, it would have to have been a scenario like that where, he could have taken her down, and, the tornadoes, the storm cellar over there. But factually, there's no evidence that backs up Ken Kratz's story,
No.
that he lured, Hallbuck into his trailer and then tied her up on the bed and, was having his way with her. And then Bobby, gets I'm sorry, Brendan gets some mail and knocks on the door, and then
Right.
he invites them in, and they both participate in the crime. So, I mean, there's no evidence that that happened. So, since there's no evidence that that happened, that means that something else would have had to happen. And again, I think to try to solve the case, you just kind of work off of some of the real evidence that the cops tried to hide or mislead the public on. And that's why I kind of still have always, curious about Cuss Road and the
Hmm.
Corey property, just because, so many bones get scattered of
Right.
trees, all, a ways away from the Avery Salvage Yard property. And the fact that these dogs, I mean, as much as cops can be dirty and corrupt, and there probably is a lot of that in this case, the dogs aren't going to be corrupt, or misguided. So,
Oh, well, they used in convicting a murderer, they brought up the dogs and the woman who was walking that dog. And they're claiming in convicting a murderer, the reason there's bones in the quarry is it blew there from
right,
Stephen's
that happens
burn
all the
pit.
time,
Right? As,
See, you and I deal with our share of wind in Illinois, and it ain't that much different than Wisconsin,
right.
So,
Yeah.
um,
So yeah, that's their new thing, that it blew there. And so that's why the dog would go there, because it blew from the burn pit.
or the more logical scenario is that that's really where something bad happened, and
Right.
that's why the dogs got the smells and the sniffs, that they did, and that's why the police are seen in photographs, hanging around and gathering around, Cuss Road, because
Right.
something may have really happened in that area, So
Mhm.
that's a more logical scenario.
Right. What are your thoughts on Bobby Dassey?
Well, I always found it interesting too, Jax, that he's never tried to clear his name, you know. I
Mhm.
mean, over the last several years, ever since Zellner has really zeroed in on him, you know, as as an alternative suspect, he's always tried to just stay in the background, the limelight. And her people have tried to interview him and have interviewed him a couple times. I think kind of things ended, after they had brought up the computer, with all the disturbing and violent pornography and the violence that was found on his computer. So I think at that point in time, he's kind of always backed off, wanting to talk to her. But I mean, I think Stevens always felt that whoever did harm Teresa was probably somebody connected to the family or the property,
Mhm.
rather than that she just left, the salvage yard that afternoon and you know, pulled off the side of the road to either take a photograph or had something car trouble and was killed by a stranger. That doesn't seem logical. So I think the fact that so many of his eyewitness, or I should say eyewitness, but his trial testimony has been debunked and proven to be false, and not factual,
Right.
definitely lends and bolsters Zellner in her argument that that he gave those statements and stories, to escape the heat and escape, scrutiny himself. And for him, the most logical way to do that was to point the finger, at Stephen rather
Right.
than, somebody else in his family. But I still, the one thing that kind of solidifies my belief that Zellner is on the right track as far as with him, Jax, is again, um, and they didn't blow away. But the bones that were found, in his
Right.
burn barrel, as I was telling somebody the other day, you know, the scenario that somehow Stephen burned her, which obviously the experts have debunked that possibility that somehow that Stephen could have gotten the fire, as hot as it did, and cooked her the way he did, and then his garage doesn't go up in flames itself,
Right.
or the propane tank doesn't,
Yeah.
explode and take out half the property. But but let's just say for whatever reason that somehow you can't get past that, and you just are adamant that he had to have killed her in the burn pit. Now,
Mhm.
then why in the world then would he leave a bunch of bones there, but then carry a bunch of them? What was the distance? 100 yards at least or so to
Yeah.
get to the Dassey property, and the burn barrels themselves that were over there.
Right.
So just it doesn't make, as unsophisticated as Stephen is,
Right.
the notion that he would leave a bunch of bones behind in his burn pit, but then bring a bunch of them and dispose of them in Bobby's, in the family's
Right.
burn barrel. This doesn't make much sense at all. And then we get into this story, the bizarre scenario, where Bobby picks up that dead deer carcass,
Right.
a couple days after, Teresa disappears.
Mhm.
By the time that the police are starting to investigate her disappearance and starting to look around, they're coming to the property. They haven't 100% zeroed in on Stephen, but he knows that they're at least starting to zero in on Stephen, and that at least, makes him realize, hey, if they focus on Stephen, then they're not going to look at me.
Right.
So that whole bizarre scenario where he grabs his dead deer carcass, strings it up in his garage,
Mhm.
and then totally, takes the heat off, and the police aren't even thinking about the possibility that maybe he could have dismembered, or
Right.
had something to do with Teresa, cutting her up in his garage, and the deer carcass is just kind of, put there to disguise that.
Yeah. Well, convicting a murderer made me, I mean, and I've done this over the years, but really look at the timeline, of when Barb is there and leaving and coming back again and leaving again, when Blaine is there, when Bobby is there, when Jody is calling Steven, when Earl and his buddy, whatever, I can't remember his name right now, see him when they're on the golf
Oh,
cart.
Fabian?
Yeah,
Fabian?
Fabian,
Yeah,
Robert
Fabian.
Fabian.
Yeah.
So the timeline just doesn't work for Stephen to be doing these things and then to go to Crivets when that you would think, okay, if you did something to Teresa Hallbach and you need people to be gone so you can use the car crusher and do all this, then why would you go to Crivets that weekend? It makes no sense. You
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. Yeah, definitely the case. And even, you know, I mean, just those first couple of days, when the police are showing up, I mean, Steven's not hiding from them as far as, he's willingly, talking to them and answering their questions. And obviously, if he had something to do with it, you would think he immediately would have lawyered up or gotten out of town, to begin with. That would have been the time to get out of town was around, the 31st or November 1st, rather than staying there day after day after day. He's
Right.
been interviewed by, the Wisconsin TV people are starting to show up there because the cops had told them. Again, it wasn't like the reporters were just that smart and realized, oh, Steven's the guy.
Yeah.
No, you had the police telling them because they wanted to put pressure on, Steve, and also, take the heat off themselves for the federal, for the $36 million lawsuit that was
Right.
coming to a head right now. So.
Well, something I thought was interesting in your update with the phone call with Steven was him saying it wasn't until he saw like crime scene photos that he then saw pry marks on the door of his trailer.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's one of those key things that for some reason has gotten overlooked or hasn't gotten the attention that it really deserves. But yeah, that definitely kind of helps bolster, his belief that after he and Chuck had went to the Menards that night, that, and again, they saw the
Mm-hmm.
taillights. I'm trying to remember which one it
He
was.
he went back and forth on it too. He
Yeah,
wasn't sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
That was lights. It was vehicle lights, no
Right.
matter what. It could have been both. It could have been, it
Yeah.
could have been both. But, uh, but, but again, especially since everybody on this conversation, was very familiar with Avery Road, and its proximity, to the state highway,
Right.
was it 149 or 147?
47.
Yeah, 147. I always want to call 49, but it's 147.
Mm-hmm.
But just, whoever was in that vehicle, it probably had to be somebody that was still, on the property,
Right.
So, and, if it was Bobby, then the fact that, there was Primarks later discovered after the fact on the property. And then again, we all know, that Stephen realized that the blood was kind of gone the next day when he went back into the sink, after he had been bleeding profusely from that finger because it got cut, you know, earlier when he was, working with the vehicle.
Yeah.
So I mean, just those events, when you add them all up, definitely bolster Zellner's case and her theory that Bobby's going around, you know, and again, getting back to Swinsky, I mean, moving the
Mm-hmm.
vehicle. So I mean, he definitely seems like there's a pattern of behavior as far as that he's doing what he can to point the evidence and steer the evidence towards Stephen, and by doing so, it definitely takes the heat off himself, and
Mm-hmm.
and raises the suspicion on Stephen even more so.
Well, and Bobby's own mother posted on Facebook that Bobby had told her that he didn't see her walking towards the trailer
Right,
and that she had left.
right, and I'd have to go back and see too, but there was also, didn't Stephen point out that you couldn't even, that from where Bobby's front door was, that you
Right.
really wouldn't be able to see it to begin with. So the
Correct.
police just took that statement, or Ken Kratz took that statement at face value and never even went out to the property themselves to see whether or not that was true.
Mm-hmm.
And that was such an important statement, in that trial, because that pretty much left the jury with the impression that nobody ever sees Teresa Halbach alive, after she started walking over to Stephen Avery's trailer. So therefore, he must be the person that, or the monster that killed her and dismembered her.
Yeah. So, what is next for you? Are you going to continue to cover this case? Do you think you'll write another book? Are you going to write a book on Ricky Hochstetler's case?
With Ricky, I would say probably not, just because I don't think that there's I don't want to say there's not enough there, but just there's too many unanswered questions as far as with that case, and I don't. And I don't know what I would say, if somehow his case ever got solved, that would be one thing. Then I would definitely open up, the possibility to that. But I think it's probably more likely I'll stick with Stephen's case and Brendan's, and keep doing reporting on it when there's a reason to, and whether or not another book or an update would be in the cards, I would hope so. We'll just kind of have to wait and see. 2024 could really be a big year for Stephen, on a lot of fronts now that, Suckowitz is off the case. The Court of Appeals now has to decide, the whole Tom Sawinski evidence, and, and or kick it back to the new judge, so again, I think that if they're ever going to get an evidentiary hearing or a new trial, now is probably the time that it's going to happen, with her being off the case, and this newly discovered evidence again that points to Bobby Dassey as being a logical Denny suspect, and also gets into the whole Brady, exculpatory evidence, evidence being withheld from Dean Strang and Jerry Buting by the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office. So,
Yeah.
The one thing that's kind of surprised me a little bit though over these years is I would have thought that after Scott Walker got defeated, that
Yeah.
that especially with and Brad Schimmel being out too as the Attorney General, because he was the one that fought so hard to keep Brendan locked up even after Judge Duffin had signed the paperwork, and I was at the prison in Portage County waiting for Brendan to get let out, and it never happened.
Right.
But but uh, but I would have thought that with the new governor, with the current governor,
Yeah. Evers.
in yeah, Evers, in power, that he would have been open to granting Stephen clemency or overturning the conviction, and for whatever reason, he's been just like Scott Walker and Brad Schimmel,
Right.
which is really disappointing because oftentimes it's the Democrats that really have a reputation for being a lot more aware and cognizant of wrongful convictions, and
Yeah.
being in touch with the social justice movement, especially wrongful conviction cases, and in this case, Evers just seems like he really hasn't done much of anything at all. Either
Yeah.
he's not aware of the case, or he's not up to speed on it, or he just has been told by his handlers, to stay out of it,
Right.
and that's really disappointing because it just seemed like Avery and Dassey really didn't get much of a fair shake as far as with Scott Walker and Brad Schimmel, as far as they just seemed to take the case at face value and really didn't do their own independent research like we've all done.
Right.
That's led us to the point where a lot of people just feel, hey, give them a new trial or give them an evidentiary hearing at the minimum.
Yeah.
So we'll see. But
Right.
like I said, we're 2 weeks away from 2024 starting, and I think this coming year, more so than the last 4 or 5 years, I think there's a lot more reason to be optimistic as far as what may happen just with the new judge being on the case.
Right.
We'll see. We'll see. I might be wrong.
When you first released the book, you did some kind of book tour appearances. Are you going to be doing that for this one?
I think so, probably. I'll just kind of have to wait and see. I'll have to, look into scheduling that. I kind of got right now just doing some radio podcast interviews for the next. I got a couple more lined up here the next couple weeks or so. But I know in March of this year, Plainfield, Illinois Public Library just reached out to me. They're doing a true crime convention. I'll give you more details on that, Jax. But
Sure.
It's late March, and they're having 3 authors for that, so I'm going to be one of the 3. So I'll for sure be talking more about Stephen's case at that event, then for sure. Then so, but yeah, I'll see. It's if I get an opportunity to get up to Wisconsin again this year, I'll certainly try to do that. And like I said, we'll just kind of have to wait and see what happens too with with their cases as well.
Right. And as I hold up your book again, where is? I know it's on Amazon. That's where I got it. Is it available other places, or?
I mean, I know for sure. Just checking online, Barnes and Noble, carries it, and you can order it through them as well. Wild Blue Press, and just about in the last 2 weeks, probably about 2 weeks ago, Audible, Kevin Pierce, who did the original narration for the Audible version of the book, Jax, they brought him back to do the update as well. So there's a lot of people that like to listen to books, on Audible, and so we have that available now as well. And Kevin does a real good job. Like I said, he did the original narration. He's done narration for like 4 or 5 of my books. He's got a great voice. He's down in Florida, and I was totally fine when somebody reached out and asked me about possibilities as far as to do another audio book version. I definitely told him, I'm like, yeah, can we see if Kevin Pierce is available and wants to do it again? And he jumped at the opportunity, so I'm glad about that.
Oh, good. Yeah, so for people who are going to be traveling for the holidays, they can listen.
And one thing I just thought of this, and I still don't even have my own copy of it yet. I'm like you; it's like I have the paperback version, but they do have a hard copy
Yeah.
that Wild Bill Press is, and I'm waiting. I should be getting. They told me it might not come till January, but I would just that's another possibility. That for people too is a keepsake is
Uh-huh.
the hard copy version of the book as well is available. Unlike the original version, 2018, you can only get in paperback, whereas now
Here's
you can.
my
Yeah,
here's
you
my
got it. Oh wow!
autographed ones of your original one.
I'd say that's like the nicest handwriting I've ever seen of myself. So,
Yeah.
oh man.
Well, anything else you want to leave people with? That anything from the case or whatever?
No, I just let people know that like I said, just keep your head up, and I appreciate everybody taking an interest in the case. I mean, so many of you just do a phenomenal job as far as your research and coming up with theories or re-examining evidence, and that's a good thing. And just keep on pressing. I would say just kind of wait to see what where things go here the next 3 or 4 months. But I think Zellner, I mean, she's still as hungry, and ferocious today as she was when Mickey Murder came out and she first took Stephen's case. And as a reminder for everybody, these cases unfortunately do take 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years sometimes. Ryan Ferguson, as I tell people all the time,
Yeah.
is a perfect example. Whereas, people like you and I mean, there's no doubt that even when I read that opinion in August, I was kind of I was deflated too. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. But
Mm-hmm.
then when I read the ruling, I'm like, well, this looks like a sixth grader, wrote this thing. I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a regurgitation as far as, well, the prosecution said this and
Yeah.
the attorney general's office said this. So I mean, just real good judges don't write their opinions that way. And as I pointed out earlier, look at Judge Ludwig and how he masterfully wrote, the yarn that he did as far as, smashing to pieces Andy Colburn's
Yeah.
federal lawsuit against Netflix and the producers. So
Mm-hmm.
you have judges that I highly regard, that taken a strong interest in this case, and can, and you just hope that Stephen and Brendan would get those kinds of judges from here on out. But and it's a big unknown right now as far as how this Judge Lambrick's going to turn out. I couldn't tell you how he's going to do, but like I
Yeah.
said, as I pointed out earlier, at least he's got the background that you would hope and think that he's not connected to the people in Manitowoc County. So whatever decision he makes will be his own decision, and we'll just have to, dissect it and analyze it and see what he comes up with then, Jax.
Is there any idea of how long that could be?
Um, no, I should actually ask Kathleen that. I know she's still got a little time right now where to file, but I would think by spring, summer at the latest, that we should get a updated ruling,
Okay.
from the Court of Appeals on the appeal, of her ruling as far
Yeah.
as with the Tom Sawinski evidence.
Okay.
So I would think first quarter, second quarter at the latest. So
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us again and for your constant investigating and updating on the Stephen Avery case. Uh, get called Wrecking Crew by John Ferak. I highly recommend everybody pick up a copy. And happy holidays to you, John, and to everybody out there.
thank you very much again, Jax, for being on here. I always appreciate the opportunity to be here, and just wishing everybody a super safe and wonderful holiday season wherever you are in the world right now.
All right. Well, then we're out for tonight. And as I always end every live that I do, investigation continues. All right. I've ended the live.